and we're going to discuss the work of Theodor Adorno. Adorno is one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, at least in continental European philosophy. And as I said on the first day, his thinking, his philosophy is always in a dialogue with Kant and Hegel. He was also deeply interested in the question of art, and in particular questions of modern art, 20th century art. And as we'll see, he's also engaging with the idealist tradition that we've been discussing for the last few days. Some of you may know a lot about Adorno already. Some of you may not know very much about him. So I think it's necessary for me to begin by talking about a book which Adorno wrote and published in 1947. He wrote it with his friend and colleague Max Horkheimer. This is a very, very famous book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I'm sure that some of you are familiar with the contents of this book. But it's important to understand some of the basic ideas in Dialectic of Enlightenment, because Dialectic of Enlightenment presents the philosophy of history which is in the background of nearly all of Adorno's work. So in his book on aesthetics, in his main book on aesthetics, which we will discuss today, he is depending on the philosophy of history of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. That's always in the background of what he is saying, and it's always supporting what he's saying. So in this book, he and Horkheimer argue that human beings lived in a mythical world originally, way back in history. Human beings lived in a mythical world in which there was no sharp distinction between the sensory and the conceptual. So you can see some echoes there with the discussion that we've been having the last 2 days about the idea of mythology in Schelling and in Hegel. So this is similar to the notion of the world of Greek mythology as presented by the idealist philosophers. But for Adorno and Horkheimer, this is a world of compulsion and repetition. It's not simply a world in which there is no sharp distinction between the senses and the intellect, between sensory experience and conceptualization. That might be regarded as the positive side, but the negative side is that it is also a world of compulsion, of fear and repetition. Human beings make sacrifices to the gods, who are objects of fear as well as veneration, and human beings lack power over nature at this point in history. So a very important concept, absolutely central concept, which Adorno and Horkheimer introduce in this book, is the concept of instrumental reason. So instrumental reason is the process of breaking out of the mythical world into a world which is divided into the subjective and the objective. There's a clear distinction emerges between human subjects and the objectified world which they inhabit. Because the world is objectified, it can be increasingly controlled, but this is not possible unless the human subjects who use instrumental reason also control and discipline themselves. So in other words, that impulses have to be controlled, spontaneity has to be controlled, so that human beings can acquire domination over nature. And this is the fateful character of the dialectic which Adorno and Horkheimer are exploring. So in the book, there is a very famous episode which summarizes this thought. And it's the episode from the Odyssey of Homer, where Odysseus has to evade the Sirens. So the Sirens are mythical female creatures who entice sailors to their doom, entice them to their death. And Odysseus avoids this fate. You can see this depicted on a Greek vase here, by having himself tied to the mast of the ship. So he can hear the song of the Sirens, but he is not tempted to throw himself into the water and to drown. So for Adorno and Horkheimer, this summarizes very nicely the dialectic of enlightenment. Odysseus is famously cunning. He's famed for his intelligence or his cunning. So he thinks of a way that he can avoid or evade the mythical powers by having himself bound to the mast of the ship. But this appears quite clearly in the picture, I think, in the illustration. He has to become rigid and lifeless himself in order to save his life, in the interests of self-preservation, which is the English translation of the German word Selbstbehauptung, which is also an important concept in Adorno. So in order to maintain himself, in order to preserve himself, Odysseus has to make himself rigid and lifeless. So that in the interpretation of the philosophers, subjectivity is robbed of life by the very process of enlightenment, the application of intelligence, which it uses in order to survive. So there's a contradiction, or a dialectic, as they say, in the very process of enlightenment. In the interests of survival, the life which is preserved becomes less and less lively, if I can put it like that. They also call this the introversion of sacrifice, the introversion of sacrifice. So what this means is that sacrifice to the mythical gods is already secretly instrumental. So in other words, when human beings sacrifice to the gods, this is because they want something in return. They want something in exchange. It's not simply a giving something up. It's not simply giving something to the gods because there is an expectation of exchange. So there is already a instrumental aspect to sacrifice. And similarly, myth is already an attempt at explanation. So a mythical view of the world which understands nature as inhabited by divine powers or mythical powers. This is already an attempt to understand the world or to explain the world. So myth is already proto-rational. So the important point here is that nothing is what it seems to be. Myth is not purely myth, it's already on the way to becoming enlightenment. And as we'll see in a moment, enlightenment is returns to myth, or enlightenment has a tendency to return to myth. So myth is already enlightenment, and enlightenment reverts to myth. So yesterday we were talking about Hegel's view of the modern world, and the way in which the modern world is dominated by abstract rules and principles, and by what Hegel calls the culture of reflection. So Hegel already has an anticipation of the kind of picture of the modern world that we find in Adorno, and Adorno is very much influenced by Max Weber. And the notion of instrumental reason comes from Weber's notion of Zweckrationalität, which Weber thinks is characteristic of modern society. So the point about instrumental reason is it enables you to find the best means to achieve a given end, so it maximizes efficiency. But this kind of reason has nothing to say about which ends or purposes human beings should pursue. It's purely devoted or oriented towards efficiency, effectiveness, and the whole question of value, the whole question of purpose cannot be answered by instrumental reason. So the analysis of Adorno is that in the modern world, instrumental reason becomes totalized, or it tends to become its own end. This is a kind of paradox, but efficiency becomes the end of everything, making everything as profitable, as efficient as possible. And this is the sense in which enlightenment reverts to myth, because instrumental reason itself becomes an opaque, irresistible power which dominates our lives. So the very process which enabled us to escape from the mythical world, in the end returns us to a kind of mythical world. But now it's the opaque power of instrumental reason. So as I said, this conception of the modern world is very reminiscent of Hegel's description of the culture of reflection. There is a strict, a rigid separation between the subject and the object. Life is governed by abstract principles, or what Hegel calls universal forms, laws, duties, rights, maxims, all prevail as determining reasons and are the chief regulator. So you can already guess from what I've said so far that when Adorno develops his aesthetic theory, he will be very influenced by Hegel's thesis of the end of art. Clearly, that is a very complex thesis, and there have been many arguments about what Hegel means by the end of art. But certainly, Adorno is beginning from that point in his own reflections on 20th century art. So we find these reflections in their most complete form in Adorno's aesthetic theory, Ästhetische Theorie. So this is Adorno's final masterpiece. 3 years earlier, he published Negative Dialectics, which is his other chef-d'oeuvre, his other masterpiece. In fact, Adorno died in 1969, and it's not, the Ästhetische Theorie is not complete. It's not in its final form, but it is very close to being complete. And it was first published in 1973. So this is an extremely detailed and complex discussion of the question of what is art, how do you understand art in historical terms, in social terms, what is the internal dynamic of art, what is the relation between form and content, what is the status of aesthetic beauty, all the questions that we have been discussing so far over the past few days. And as I said at the beginning, Adorno is in a dialogue with Hegel and with Kant. So there is a very famous first sentence, which at the very beginning of the book, I've put it in red here. Adorno says, "It is self-evident that nothing concerning art is self-evident anymore. Not its inner life, not its relation to the world, not even its right to exist." Yeah? So he begins the book by saying, everything has to be examined and questioned. So Hegel, as we saw yesterday, Hegel describes the separation of art from its religious function. Art becomes autonomous. Hegel doesn't use the word autonomous, but he has a very similar idea. And this is a central concept for Adorno, the idea of autonomous art. So autonomous art is the art of the bourgeois era. Artists are no longer working for the church, or they're no longer working for a feudal master, or they're no longer simply employed by the nobility in order to produce entertainment. The artist is autonomous and is in fact dependent on the art market, is dependent on selling his work or her work in order to survive. So in the history of music, we can see this transition in the transition from Haydn to Beethoven. Haydn worked for a member of the nobility. He was an employee of an aristocratic house for most of his life, whereas Beethoven survived by selling his music. He was not an employee of a noble person. So for Adorno, as we'll see today, this autonomy of art, the modern autonomy of art, is deeply ambivalent. As we saw, Hegel thinks that art pays for its autonomy with a loss of content and with the arbitrary subjectivity of the artist. Adorno has a dialectical theory of the autonomy of art and its consequences, but for him, the basic problem is not is not loss of content. That was what worried Hegel. As soon as art becomes separated from its social function, for example, from its religious function, then the question of what the content of art will be becomes problematic. That's not the central problem for Adorno. The central problem is the actual autonomy of the very notion of the autonomy of art and what that means. Sorry. Okay, so we can trace this opposition in terms of the metaphysical status of art in Hegel and in Adorno. So as we saw yesterday, Hegel defines beauty as the sensuous appearance of the idea, das sinnliche Scheinen der Idee. So for Hegel, art expresses a metaphysical truth about the reconciliation of opposites terms of in a sensory medium. For Adorno, reconciliation is not a metaphysical truth. On the contrary, he thinks that we live in an antagonistic world. This is because Adorno is working in the Marxist tradition, so he thinks that society is characterized by conflict and antagonism between social classes. So the social world is profoundly unfree and unreconciled and dominated by instrumental reason. And this makes the autonomy of art profoundly ambivalent. Adorno very much likes a statement which was made by the French novelist Stendhal, who said that that art is une promesse de bonheur. That art is a promise of happiness. So the point is that Adorno does not believe that art presents a metaphysical reconciliation which already exists and is expressed in what Hegel calls the idea. On the contrary, he thinks that art shows us a possible state of reconciliation or a possible state of happiness, but this is in contradiction to the state of the social world, in contradiction to the condition of the social world. So how does art communicate this happiness? Another important aspect of the Dialectic of Enlightenment is the contrast which Adorno and Horkheimer draw between mimesis and instrumental reason. So mimesis means imitation, something like imitation, and they argue that this is the way in which early human beings, in prehistory, human beings related to the world. So in a mimetic relation to the object, you identify with the object. There is no clear separation between subject and object. and he uses the word, or the German word, sich anschmiegen. So I tried to translate that into Portuguese, and it comes out as something like aconchegar-se, as the idea of sich anschmiegen. So this is an intimate relation to reality, an identificatory relation to the world, and not a relation which is characterized by opposition, difference, separation between subject and object. So a fundamental idea that Adorno has is that artworks are a kind of refuge for mimesis in a rationalized world. The work of art still has this imitative relation to reality, and the interpenetration of the sensory and the intellectual, of the conceptual and the natural, is available in the work of art. So, of course, this is still very much the same idea that we find in Kant and Hegel, expressed in different ways. That Kant calls that the play of the imagination and the understanding, and Hegel talks about the sensuous appearance of the idea. So the notion that art is a kind of enclave where we still can still enjoy this mimetic relation to the world is a very similar idea. Where Adorno differs from his predecessors is that he believes that this relation is suppressed or repressed by instrumental rationality. We don't find that social diagnosis at all in Kant, and I don't think we find it in Hegel in that form. Certainly not in the form that Adorno will develop it, as we'll see in a moment. So I've talked about this notion of the autonomy of the artwork. This is the central feature of art in the bourgeois period. That art is autonomous. It presents a free and self-contained world, which is opposed to the social world. In one sense, art belongs to a different level of reality, or a different kind of reality. But this is deeply ambivalent. By offering a domain of freedom, mimesis and not instrumental reason, works of art encourage us to accept an unfree social world. It's as though we can accept social reality because we're able to enjoy art. So it's a kind of compensation for the lack of freedom in the social world. But for Adorno, this is a contradiction. The idea that we can be free in the experience of art, even though the social world is unfree, is a fundamental contradiction. And works of art also offer us an image of reconciliation, that's the promesse de bonheur, that's the promise of happiness, which is contained in the work of art. But there is a tendency to project that image of reconciliation onto the social world as if it already existed. So, of course, this is precisely what Adorno thinks happens in Hegel's philosophy, that that reconciliation is turned into a metaphysical reality which already exists if we understand the world in the right way. Whereas for Adorno, this is an image of a future, of a possible future, and not an image of reality. So Adorno says, as a result of its inevitable withdrawal from theology, so that's when art ceases to perform the religious function that we discussed yesterday, a secularization without which art would never have developed, art is condemned to provide the world as it exists with a consolation that strengthens the spell of that from which the autonomy of art wants to free itself. So that's a very complicated sentence, but nearly every sentence in aesthetic theory has that kind of complexity about it, because Adorno is trying to describe an ambivalent process, or a dialectical process, which always has two sides. It always has a negative side and a positive side, and it's almost impossible to separate the negative side from the positive side. They're always interconnected. So here he's saying, so art liberates itself from theology, it liberates itself from religion, and then that enables art to develop all its power and all its potential. This is also a thought we found in Hegel. But it then offers a kind of consolation, or another word would be compensation. Art then offers a kind of compensation for the unfree, antagonistic character of the social world. So it strengthens the spell of that from which the autonomy of art wants to free itself. So spell is another technical, it's almost a technical word in Adorno to refer to the way in which there's a ideological consciousness in modern society which is so profound that human beings don't even understand that this consciousness is ideological. It's so pervasive, it's so omnipresent that it ceases to be visible. And it's like being under a spell, enchantment, under a kind of magic. But it's a magical compulsion that modern society places us under. So art, because it offers this alternative reality, wants to escape from this. It wants to escape from this compulsion, or escape from this spell. But by becoming an alternative reality, it also offers a consolation, or it offers a compensation. So this is the sense in which the autonomy of art is deeply ambivalent for Adorno. And he says that art cannot avoid having an affirmative dimension, even when it sets itself in opposition to society. So this is the way in which he summarizes this problem. So this notion of the affirmative dimension goes back to an article that Adorno's colleague Herbert Marcuse wrote in the 1930s called The Affirmative Character of Culture. That the very fact of separating culture from society as if it were a separate domain makes it into an affirmation of the existing society. And Adorno also uses this concept of affirmation to describe what happens to autonomous art. Okay, I think I will. I'll stop at that point and ask you if you have any questions about what I've said so far. Okay, can we compare Adorno's concept of spell and Marx's concept of commodity fetishism? Yeah. I'm thinking about the first question about the spell and commodity fetishism. So commodity fetishism is connected with the idea that we cease to understand the process of production, and we think that commodities are simply embodiments of exchange values. So it's related to Adorno's notion of the spell. Yes. Earlier on, I talked about the idea of exchange. When I was talking about sacrifice. So the idea that Adorno and Horkheimer have there is that sacrifice is already an exchange. So there's already an exchange principle built into sacrifice, even though it doesn't appear like an exchange. So for Adorno, the notion of the exchange principle and the equivalence of exchange is connected with the dominance of instrumental reason, because everything is reduced to an equivalence, and the use value of commodities, as Marx would put it, in other words, their quality is dominated by their exchange value. Everything is dominated by exchange value, which is something abstract and general. But we don't comprehend that because of commodity fetishism. So I think it is connected. What is instrumental reason? One way in which you could understand the rise of instrumental reason is like this. So in a pre-modern society, if you think about agriculture, for example, in a pre-modern society, there might be all kinds of rituals and practices associated with, say, sowing the seed for the crops to grow. There might be religious ceremonies or rituals to do with cultivating the crops and harvesting them and so forth. But these ceremonial or ritual or religious aspects of the practice are not separated from the aspects of the practice which actually grow the food. Yeah. but now we have agribusiness. We have agribusiness. So everything is rationalized and everything is instrumental. There is no ritual. Everything is just done in order to grow as much wheat or corn or whatever as possible with the maximum efficiency. So this is the basic idea of the rise of instrumental reason, that everything symbolic and everything ritualistic, everything which is unnecessary from a purely pragmatic point of view is eliminated, and practices become purely organized in terms of efficiency. So instrumental reason is all about just being as efficient as possible. Does that help? So the autonomy of art within the context of aestheticization of life and commodification of art. Well, that's a difficult question. So Adorno knows very well that the autonomy of art goes together with the commodification of art. They are two sides of the same process. So this is another way in which the autonomy of modern art is ambivalent, because as I said earlier on, the modern artist has to make a living by selling work, selling art. So the art becomes a commodity and it's subjected to the rules of the market. So the autonomy is also ambivalent. This means that art is both, he says it's opposed to society, but it's also deeply involved in society and deeply involved in the capitalist market. So it's both at the same time. And Adorno is also very aware of that problem with the commodification of art. The aestheticization of life. I don't know exactly what you mean by that. It could mean breaking down the barrier between art and life, or apparently breaking down that barrier, maybe, which is something I will talk about later on. Yeah, that's what it means. Yeah, breaking down the barrier between art and life. So, I mean, to me, aestheticization of life would maybe mean, could be just another aspect of commodification. It just means that people are sold different lifestyles, and they need commodities in order to live a certain kind of lifestyle. So this could be another aspect of commodification. I think the aesthetic side, or maybe a way of concealing instrumental rationality. Again, this is something I will say more about later on. Yeah. Okay, Mateus has a question. Could I say Adorno's aesthetic critiques comprehends the production of art based on as an alienating mean, keeps the special and official with the social forms. Yeah. it doesn't propose an action turning the spectator emancipated. Yeah. Again, this is a complicated question because Adorno is not saying the problem with art is that it just offers us a kind of compensation, and therefore it stops us from actually changing the world. He's not saying that. Because he's quite suspicious of that kind of activism, I think, or a certain conception of political activism. So again, he has a very ambivalent, you might say ambivalent position, that there is something very important about the fact that art holds open a kind of alternative reality. There's something both positive and negative about it simultaneously. It's critical, so art is both critical and affirmative. And inevitably it's both critical and affirmative. But so I know there are many attempts to connect art with social action. And again, I'll talk about that later, because after the break, I want to talk about a number of different strategies in modern art and contemporary art, which try to break out of these dilemmas, which Adorno is describing. And we can think about what would be his attitude towards these dilemmas and the different ways of resolving them. But I think he would think that trying to turn art itself into a form of activism was a mistake, because you need to preserve the distance between art and social reality. Art cannot be critical unless there is a distance between art and social reality. So if you turn art just into a form of political action, you've lost the distance. You've lost the critical distance. Wow, there's so many questions. Does the idea of instrumental reason, the inversion, effectiveness, related democracy theory of the sense that profit becomes the goal? Yes, exactly, Jacqueline. Yeah, that's absolutely right. The profit becomes the goal, or instrumental reason becomes totalized. That's another way of saying what Adorno is also saying. Aestheticization of the world. Okay, I don't know Lipovetsky's book, but it seems to me that they are talking about the way capitalism itself uses aestheticization in order to promote it, to promote itself. Do I have a hypothesis about what is the new religion of the modern world? No, I don't have a hypothesis about that. That's too big. That question is too big. Yeah, so the relation between Hegel's theory of art and Adorno's passage through Walter Benjamin. So Adorno was very interested in Walter Benjamin's theory of art, but I think he thought Benjamin's theory of art was sometimes not sufficiently mediated. Benjamin was quite influenced by Bertolt Brecht at a certain period, and this is the reason why Adorno is often criticized, because he always wants to insist there must be a distance between art and the social world, or and for many people, this seems like a kind of quietism or passivity or refusal um, to give a political role to art, a genuine political role to art. But these are all very complicated questions. Okay, so let me think. So, are there any more questions before we have a break? No. Okay, so let's have a break until let me see, it will be 3:30 your time. Yeah, and then we'll continue at 3:30. Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. So I want to now say a little bit about the critique of Hegel, or one aspect of Adorno's critique of Hegel, which is to do with the beauty of nature. So as we saw, the beauty of nature is very important for Kant, and in some respects more important or more significant than the beauty of art. In fact, by contrast, Hegel has very little to say about the beauty of nature, and he concentrates primarily on the beauty of living organisms. And here it's a question of the beauty of the abstract forms of organisms. But natural organisms do not adequately express what Hegel calls the idea. And Hegel has even less to say about the beauty of landscape, about the beauty of the countryside, because we don't even have the coherence of organic form. So the countryside, the landscape may evoke pleasant feelings in us, but this is an inadequate form of beauty. So essentially, Hegel argues that the beauty of art is much superior to the beauty of nature. At one point in the lectures, he says that anything spiritual, in other words, anything belonging to the human domain, is superior to everything natural. Anything spiritual is superior to everything natural. So he asserts the absolute primacy and superiority of Geist, spirit, over nature. And he argues that spirit, the idea finds its true embodiment in human subjectivity. Human subjectivity is this process of self-realization or self-particularization, which Hegel thinks is the essential process of the idea. So it's only in human subjectivity and the expression of human subjectivity that what Hegel calls the idea can find an adequate expression. Now, Adorno is very critical of this aspect of Hegel's thinking because of what I said at the beginning about the Dialectic of Enlightenment, that there is a repression of our civilization begins with a repression of our mimetic relation to nature. So there's a repression of nature which lies at the very basis of culture and civilization. And as far as in Adorno's view, Hegel is complicit with this repression in his assertion of the priority of spirit over nature. So Adorno says he has a whole chapter in the aesthetic theory which is about the beauty of nature. And he says that natural beauty was not dialectically transcended, both negated and maintained on a higher plane by Hegel. Rather, it was repressed. Natural beauty was repressed. The concept of natural beauty rubs on a wound associated with the violence that the artwork, a pure artifact, inflicts on nature. So this is a very strong claim that because the artwork is a product of human technical ability and the manipulation of material, it inflicts a kind of wound or violence on nature. So nature is connected in Adorno with what he calls the non-identical. So this is a concept which emerges in negative dialectics, which is the other major book by Adorno that he published in the mid-1960s. He doesn't use the concept of the non-identical in Dialectic of Enlightenment, but it's the main concept, or one of the main concepts, in negative dialectics. So the idea is that there is always an element in our experience of the world, an element of the natural world which escapes conceptualization and which escapes our attempt to identify it and to fix it. And because Hegel's philosophy is centered on the unity of subject and object, Hegel represses the non-identical. The non-identical is this element in our experience which cannot be incorporated into that unity of subject and object. So he says that in the chapter on natural beauty, Adorno says that natural beauty is the trace of the non-identical in things under the spell of universal identity. So natural beauty, the beauty of nature, is a kind of marker or a kind of representation or representative of the non-identical, what escapes instrumental reason and escapes the identity of exchange, market exchange, which is the dominant principle of the society. At the same time, Adorno thinks we should not hypostatize natural beauty. In other words, this is a complex aspect of Adorno's thinking, but if we said that there was such a thing as the purely non-identical, we would, in a sense, be making the non-identical identical. I don't know whether that's clear, but it's by making it something entirely separate, entirely opposed to the identical, you're creating a new duality. You're already creating a new duality. So we shouldn't hypostatize natural beauty. In other words, treat it as something completely different from society. So Adorno's argument is the way nature appears to us is always mediated by society and culture. But that doesn't mean to say that there is no such thing as natural beauty. It may be mediated by society, but that does not mean that we can reduce it to society, that it's simply a reflection of society. There is always a dialectic of identity and non-identity in Adorno. Formally speaking, we could say there's always a dialectic of identity and non-identity. So Adorno says the fact that the experience of natural beauty, according to its subjective consciousness, is entirely distinct from the domination of nature, marks out both the strength and the weakness of the experience. Its strength because it recollects a world without domination, one that probably never existed. So nature is almost an experience of nature is an experience of a world prior to society, outside society, a pre-social world, a world without domination. But that's a world that probably never existed. and its weakness, but this is also a weak experience, because through this recollection it dissolves back into that amorphousness, in other words, the lack of shape, the lack of form, out of which genius once arose for the first time became conscious of the idea of freedom that could be realized in a world free from domination. So again, aesthetic theory is a very difficult book, because every concept that Adorno introduces always has two sides. It always has a negative side and a positive side. So here he's saying the natural beauty does give us a kind of utopian experience of a world without domination. But on the other hand, there is no freedom in nature. There is no freedom in nature as such. Freedom only begins when human beings break away from nature, and become conscious of the idea of freedom. So he's stressing the dual aspect of the natural beauty there. Now, he also, in the first chapter of the book, criticizes Kant's aesthetics. He says that Kant was the first to achieve the insight that aesthetic comportment, in other words, aesthetic behavior, is free from immediate desire. So he's very interested in Kant's theory of disinterested contemplation as being the first aspect of the judgment of taste, or the judgment of beauty. Kant, he says, is the first person to actually realize this, that aesthetic contemplation is disinterested, and he snatched art away, or he removed art from the Philistinism that always wants to touch it and taste it. So he removes the aesthetic experience from immediate sensory satisfaction and from desire. But Adorno also thinks that the way in which Kant makes this argument overlooks the fact that this is disinterestedness, being disinterested. The capacity for aesthetic contemplation is a cultural achievement. So there are a few pages at the beginning of the book where he contrasts Kant and Freud. And this is something that Adorno does quite frequently in his writing. He puts Kant and Freud next to each other, because in Kant you have you often have a theory which is based in the notion of transcendental subjectivity, and Freud always gives you the naturalistic basis for subjectivity, which he thinks is missing in Kant. So the idea of disinterested contemplation for Freud would be something which is only achieved through a process which he calls sublimation. In other words, we do have these natural drives and impulses and desires, but we have to sublimate them in order to achieve the state of aesthetic contemplation. So Adorno says that the separation of the aesthetic sphere from the empirical constitutes art. This is something which he always emphasizes. Yet Kant transcendentally arrested or stopped this constitution, which is a historical process, and simplistically equated it with the essence of the artistic. And the dynamic character of the artistic is much more fully grasped by Freud's theory of sublimation. In other words, there are these elements of our sensory response to the world and of what Adorno also calls expression, which is something impulsive, which have to be sublimated in order to produce the work of art. But for Kant, aesthetics becomes paradoxically a castrated hedonism, he says, a desire without desire. So there's something, just as there's something about repressive about the way in which Hegel ignores natural beauty, he thinks there is something repressive in Kant's notion of disinterested aesthetic pleasure. Kant neglects the suppressed and unsatisfied needs that resonate in their aesthetic negation and make artworks more than empty patterns. So there are suppressed and unsatisfied needs which resonate in the work of art, even in the very fact that they cannot be, they're sublimated, they're aesthetically negated. They are still resonating, they are still implicit in the work of art. So that's the Freudian critique of Kant, if but naturally, Adorno does not think that Freud's psychoanalytic approach is without its problems. We talked about Freudian and Marxist approaches to art on the first day and what the limits of those might be. So Adorno argues that the psychoanalytic approach is problematic because, as he says, the psychologism of aesthetic interpretation easily agrees with the Philistine view of the artwork as harmoniously quieting antagonisms, a dream image of a better life, unconcerned with the misery from which this image is torn out. So the idea that the artwork reconciles conflicting psychological impulses, that it has a kind of therapeutic effect in reconciling the conflicting impulses or conflicting desires, is also a reductive psychologistic view of the work of art. So, although we can use Freud to criticize Kant or see the limitations of Kant, he's not, Adorno's not endorsing a Freudian aesthetic or a psychoanalytic aesthetic. So you'll see in that final quotation there that he talks about the artwork as harmoniously quieting antagonisms. And this is a very important aspect of aesthetic theory that, again, this is part of Adorno's critical relation to the idealist tradition. He's very critical of the idea of the artwork as an integrated or organic totality. So he has a continuous critique of the notion of the organic integration of the artwork. So here are just a few passages where he talks about this. The notion of Kantian notion of purposiveness without purpose suggests that kind of integration, because it's really saying that the artwork has a kind of functional wholeness to it. It's a functional totality, even though it doesn't have any specific purpose or specific function. But Adorno thinks that this notion it's inaccurate. It doesn't describe what artworks are actually like, and it offers the illusion of a reconciled world. So the art is illusory insofar it suggests that reconciliation is already in existence. Somebody said something? Some Persian understanding of effective life. Persian understanding of effective life. I'm not aware of that aspect of Lukács, but certainly Adorno has an argument with Lukács, because Lukács still thinks that a successful work of art should show this kind of wholeness and integration. That they had a debate. Adorno and Lukács had a very significant debate about art, and Lukács was in some respects close to the notion of socialist realism. So he thought that say a great novel should present a kind of whole, a total integrated picture of a society and how it functions. But for Adorno, that kind of integration and that kind of organic totality is, formally speaking, an illusion, or formally speaking, it's a misrepresentation of the nature of reality. So that's the basis of his argument with Lukács. I'm not familiar with what Lukács says about catharsis, or whether that's connected with this idea of a purged understanding of an effective life. Maybe it is connected with that. But so that's, for Lukács, the work of art cannot fulfill its cognitive function or its truth-telling function unless it has that kind of integrity and totality. But for Adorno, it's exactly the opposite. That kind of totalization is a lie. It's a misrepresentation. That's the difference between them. So let me see. So Adorno says here that artworks synthesize ununifiable, non-identical elements because their unity is only an element and not the magic formula of the whole. So again, philosophically, that's quite a complex statement. He's saying it's almost a paradox. It's almost an oxymoron. So, because how can the artwork synthesize elements which are not unifiable? If they can't be unified, how can they be synthesized? But he says this is because the unity is only an element. That means the idea of the unity of the artwork is itself only one aspect of the artwork. It's not. Oh, there's another question coming. Yes, it does have to do with their appreciation of realism and modernism. Lukács is critical of modernism precisely because of the elements that I'm going to speak about. This resistance to the notion of organic, integrated totality of the work of art. And Lukács thinks that realism has to have this kind of integration in order to show society as it actually is, with all its interrelating elements. Whereas Adorno thinks that this is that notion of integration is itself ideological. Formally speaking, it's ideological. Okay. So the synthesis, in fact, is not a synthesis, or the unity is only one element. That's like a paradoxical formulation. How could the unity only be one element? But the unity is not a kind of like the overarching aspect which brings everything together. Again, Adorno says, whatever may in the artwork be called a totality is not a structure that integrates the sum of its parts. Artworks are centers of energy that strain toward the whole. The vortex of this dialectic ultimately consumes the concept of meaning. So there isn't a totality which gives you a stable meaning in the artwork. Sometimes he refers to artworks as riddles or enigmas, that there isn't a stable or determinate meaning or cognitive content that we can derive from the artwork. There's always something enigmatic about the artwork. And he says that each artwork is a system of irreconcilables. So again, these are paradoxical formulations, because system etymologically means standing together or holding together. So if you have a system of irreconcilables, that's like a contradiction. If the elements cannot be reconciled, how can they form a system? And similarly, how can you synthesize elements which are non-identical? But this is part of Adorno's view of the artwork as full of tension, full of contradiction. So, for example, he also thinks that there's a tension between technique and expression. That particularly in modern art, the technical refinement has become ever more sophisticated. But there's always a tension between the purely mimetic or expressive aspect of the artwork, or the emotional aspect, if you like, and the use of technique. And Adorno thinks that expression and technique are never fully integrated. There's always going to be a kind of conflict or a kind of tension between the technical means and the expression. Okay, so now just before the break, we had a few questions about the social political content of art and how Adorno understands that. So he says that artworks are the unself-conscious historiography of their epoch. The unself-conscious historiography of their epoch. So that's very close to Hegel's idea that artworks express the deepest structures of consciousness of a historical period. So Hegel says that by saying that art is a form of absolute spirit. So art is one of the ways in which human beings understand themselves and understand their deepest concerns, understand what is most important to them in a given historical period. And Adorno thinks that something similar, that artworks are an expression of the consciousness of a period and of the way in which society functions in a given historical period. But he also says that insofar as a social function can be predicated for artworks, it is their functionlessness. So this, again, this is another of the many paradoxes that we find in aesthetic theory, that the social function of artworks is their lack of function, is their functionlessness. So this is the emphasis on the opposition between society and the work of art, which I was discussing before the break. So Adorno is critical of the idea that works of art should have some direct political content. And this is obviously a very debatable point, and we might want to discuss this later on. Many people have accused Adorno of having a very elitist conception of art, and an apolitical conception of art, because he does not think it is effective to put a direct political message or a direct political content into the work of art. So he says here that in all art that is still possible, social critique must be raised to the level of form, to the point that it wipes out all manifestly social content. So if there is social critique in the work of art, it's not in an obviously social content of the work of art. It's at the level of form and not at the level of content. Okay. And he also says that without the synthesis which confronts reality as the autonomous artwork, there would be nothing external to reality's spell. So that's, again, making the same point, that the work of art has to be opposed to reality. And if it was simply communicating a political message, then it would have a social function, and it wouldn't occupy that oppositional place or that oppositional position by virtue of its form or by virtue of its synthesis. So when he says synthesis, he means that there is a sense in which the work of art has to be self-contained. So now when he talks about the truth content, so this is really the central concept of the whole course, is what is the truth of art. The truth content cannot be separated from the concept of humanity. So artworks are images of a transformed humanity. And art is more than praxis, because by its aversion to praxis, it denounces the narrow truth of the practical world. So again, that connects up with something we were discussing before the break, that he is opposed to the idea that we can turn art into a form of political practice, because art has to be opposed to the practical world in order to perform its critical function. Okay, are there, does anyone want to ask, raise any questions about that part of the lecture? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'll complete the I'll complete what I wanted to say. So I wanted to finish by talking about some of the ways in which these tensions within the concept of art are manifested in developments in 20th century art, and use some illustrations to look at that to look at that issue. So I'm using mostly visual art to talk about this. So first of all, we need to, there's one other important aspect of Adorno's theory that we need to consider, which is the idea of the culture industry. So this is a concept which many of you are probably familiar with already. Is there a... Somebody asked a question. Adorno's critique on ideology influenced by Althusser. You would, Mateus, you'd have to say more about. Yes, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. If ideology is about interpolation, not about content, but about the interpolation of individuals as subjects, then we could say that there is a connection there. Yeah, because it's not a critique at the level of content. So disinterested contemplation of art can be seen as a kind of alienation. Yes, I think it can be seen as a kind of alienation. But this is because of the ambivalence, the fundamental ambivalence of the whole sphere of art, that it does, it offers an alternative to the social world, but it can also function as an indirect affirmation of the social world. Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about the idea of the culture industry. Oh, there's another question. This is something about Zizek and cinema. And criticizing the form underneath the content. Okay, yeah. So Zizek has a formal critique of cinema rather than a content critique. Yeah. I think there might be a connection, except Adorno wants to say it's the form of art which is critical rather than content. So maybe that's the opposite of what, but maybe Zizek is analyzing popular culture. So that was what I was going to talk about now, is Adorno's view of popular culture. So this is really this is something new about the situation in the 20th century. When Hegel was talking about art, he did not really have a concept of the culture industry. So the new situation for modernism is that it finds itself confronted with a whole industry which is producing a certain kind of art for mass consumption. So this is something which Adorno and Horkheimer famously analyze in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, what they call the culture industry. I think they invented that concept of the culture industry. So the culture industry produces standardized products for mass consumption, popular songs, films, novels, stories, and so forth. But these products are for entertainment, and they don't make any demands on the consumer. They don't make any kind of intellectual demands. They don't require any work in order to be understood or to be consumed. But the most fundamental point is that they present themselves as if they were autonomous artworks. So it's fundamental to the functioning of the culture industry that people think that what they are enjoying is in some sense an artwork which has been produced for its own sake. In other words, an autonomous artwork, but in fact it's a commodity. The products of the culture industry are commodities, and they are produced in order to realize surplus value. They're not, in fact, autonomous works of art, although they have to present themselves as autonomous works of art. Someone. Okay, that's not relevant. Okay. So there's something obviously deeply problematic about the culture industry, because it presents something which is produced as a commodity, as if it were an autonomous work of art. But this does not mean that autonomous art is unproblematic. Again, this is something we discussed before the break, because so-called autonomous art is itself involved in the capitalist art market. So Adorno says that the purity of bourgeois art, which hypostatized itself as a world of freedom in contrast to what was happening in the material world, was from the beginning bought with the exclusion of the lower classes. So light art is the social bad conscience of serious art. The truth which serious art lacked because of its social premises gives the other a semblance of legitimacy. The division itself is the truth. Least of all can the antithesis be reconciled by absorbing light into serious art or vice versa. But that is what the culture industry attempts. So someone asked a question again? No. Okay. So as I said before the break, Adorno is often, regarded as an elitist because he's so committed to the tradition of modernism. But he's very aware that the split between mass art and high art is itself it's the symptom, or it's the indication of a problem, which also is manifested in high art. That high art has become this specialized activity which has to oppose itself to art as entertainment or as light art. So again, we already saw something of that concern emerging in Hegel when he's talking about music in his own time in the 1820s, where we have the rise of so-called absolute music, in other words, pure instrumental music, and Hegel is worried that this form of music is going to become just something of interest to specialists and experts, and thereby lose what should be the function of music as an art. So we have a similar kind of issue arising here with the split between light art and high art, or with the split between mass culture and high art. And this is an ongoing aesthetic debate. In other words, some critics and theorists of art would argue that there is something problematic about forms of art which are only accessible to a small number of people, are only accessible to a minority, that there's something damaging about art which is so limited in the audience which it can claim. Okay, so this is the situation in which high art has to become more and more difficult, more and more esoteric, in order to oppose itself to the culture industry. So the existence of the culture industry forces high art to become more obscure, more difficult, more hard to access. And this is a problematic evolution which is occurring in the relation between high art and mass culture. Okay, so I just wanted to finish by looking at some of the consequences of this. So this is about the internal dialectic of modernism. So one of the features of modernism, of course, is the critique of the organic integration of the work of art, which is something we've just been talking about. So what Adorno says at one point in the aesthetic theory, what is heterogeneous in artworks is immanent to them. It is that in them that opposes unity, yet is needed by unity if it is to be more than a pyrrhic victory over the unresisting. In terms of their own structure, they are not organisms. So works of art are not organisms. Works of the highest rank are hostile to their organic aspect as illusory and affirmative. So that's quite clear. The highest works of art are hostile to the organic aspect as illusory and affirmative. Art's highest products are condemned to a fragmentariness, that is their confession that even they do not possess what is claimed by the immanence of their form. So the highest works of art have to be fragmentary in order to avoid this illusion of integration and this illusion of reconciliation. So in order to make this point, we have here a collage by the North American artist Robert Rauschenberg. So you can see that there are lots of disparate elements, some photographs, bits of painting mixed together without any real attempt to produce an integrated organic work of art. So there's a kind of there's a fragmentariness which is built into the collage, refusal of integration. So this is one feature of modernist art practice. Okay, so this is a sculpture by a British artist called Richard Long. So what we have here is a sort of a refusal to use technical means in order to shape the material, in order to form the material, in order to, so there's a kind of critique built into the fact that all Richard Long has done is to take some pieces of slate and to line them up on the floor. So this is connected, I think, with the ambivalence of what Adorno calls spiritualization. In other words, the fact that the work of art becomes more and more intellectualized and more technical. So he says that the German idealist philosophers liberated art from the last traces of feudal divertissement, in other words, entertainment, sheer entertainment. Art now has deeply significant content. However, in that spiritualization is inextricable from the requirement that everything must become form. Spiritualization becomes complicitous in the tendency that liquidates the tension between art and its other. So if everything is formed by the artist, thoroughly formed by the artist, this is precisely an expression of the domination of spirit over nature that Adorno is protesting against in his critique of Hegel's relation to natural beauty, the notion of the superiority, the total superiority of spirit over nature. So I think in this, in the work of Richard Long, we can see an attempt to fight against that tendency, because he does very little with the object. He does very little technical manipulation, very little forming. He just allows the pieces of slate to lie there without trying to shape them or form them technically into a work of art. So there's Adorno talks here about the tension between art and its other, in order, we could say, nature or the material world, which has not been shaped by art. And we can see that Long is trying to acknowledge the relation between art and its other by not totally shaping the material. Okay, so here we have another aspect of modernist art, or the kind of dialectic of modernist art, which we also discussed a little bit before the break. So, so as we've seen, for Adorno, the autonomy of modern art is deeply ambivalent. Adorno says that art is, quote, the social antithesis of society. Art is the social antithesis of society. Again, that's another paradox, we could say. So art has a different logic, which is opposed to the logic of a rationalized society. Yet the difference itself gives it a compensatory or an affirmative function. So we could say, how can art be autonomous with a good conscience when society is not autonomous? Or Adorno says this right at the beginning of aesthetic theory. He says, how can art be free if society is not free? There's something paradoxical about that idea. So we find in the 20th century many attempts to break down the barrier between art and life, or break down the barrier between art and society. In 1984, another German art theorist called Peter Bürger published a book called Theory of the Avant-Garde. Some of you might be familiar with this book, but the important point which was made by Peter Bürger in this book is that there's a difference between modernism and the avant-garde, or Bürger draws a distinction between modernism and the avant-garde. And his argument is that modernism carries out radical experiments with artistic form, but it does not try to break down the barrier between art and life. So for Bürger, the characteristic mark of the avant-garde is this hostility to the barrier, to the difference between art and life, and the attempt to break down that barrier. So here we have a picture of Joseph Beuys, the German artist, and he had an artwork which was called 7,000 Oaks, which consisted simply in planting 7,000 trees around the city of Kassel in Germany. So there you can see Beuys planting one of his trees. So you might say, well, in what sense is that a work of art? He simply seems to be planting trees around the city. But we can see this as avant-garde activity, which is trying to break down the very idea that there is a distinction between social action and art, or between life and art. But in fact, Adorno would resist this very much, I think, because he thinks that art has to have its shine, in other words, its appearance of being separate and its appearance of being self-contained, in order to offer an alternative to the social world. So if you try to break down that barrier between art and life, you lose the critical potential of art, even though that barrier or that difference is itself problematic. But we can understand, the point I'm trying to make is that we can understand these different developments in modern art as responses to the tensions which Adorno is analyzing, or responses to the problems which Adorno is analyzing. Okay, and finally, I wanted to say something about modernism and postmodernism. So Adorno died in 1969, so he did not really live long enough to see the development of postmodern art. He was as we have seen, he was a strong defender of modernism, high modernism, we could say. But he was also aware of the internal dialectic of modernism. In other words, he was aware of the internal problems of modernism. So modernist art defines itself against the culture industry, as we saw a few minutes ago. It's deliberately difficult, it's often abstract, it makes itself austere, because only in this way can it be faithful to the reality of a rationalized society. in other words, the severity or the austerity of the work of art is itself a mimetic response to the dominance of instrumental rationality in the advanced capitalist society. That's Adorno's idea. So he defended the music of Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School. He actually studied composition with Alban Berg, and he is very enthusiastic about the novels and plays of Samuel Beckett, but he also seems to be aware of the limits of the dynamic of opposition which is built into high modernism. In his lectures on aesthetics, so this is not in the book Aesthetic Theory, but in lectures on aesthetics which he gave in 1958-59, he talks about the loss of tension arising from the absoluteness of the construction principle. In other words, the more sophisticated the technical means of art become, and the more dominant the technique becomes and the construction of the work of art, then there is a loss of tension because there is no longer any resistance from the material which is being shaped by the artist. And in these lectures, he does at one point talk about the music of John Cage, the aleatory music of John Cage, where John Cage, the American composer, uses random techniques in order to escape from the control of the artist over the material. Now, postmodernism tries to break down the barrier. There are two, many important features of postmodernism as a movement, but there are two which I would highlight in particular. One is that it tries to break down the barrier between mass culture and high art. So a lot of postmodern artworks use elements of popular art. They integrate elements of popular art or mass culture rather than setting themselves up in opposition to mass culture. And another historical important feature of postmodernism is that it breaks with the idea that there is a historically most advanced style. So I think this is an idea to which Adorno is still committed. He still thinks that there is an artistic style which expresses the character of the age, expresses the character of the epoch. Whereas in postmodernism, what we find artists who start to use the whole repertoire of different historical styles or ways of composing for musicians or ways of painting for painters and so forth, rather than believing that there is one style which is the correct style for the time or the correct style for the epoch. Postmodernism also reverts to the use of ornamentation and moves away from functionalism, as we can see in this picture of the postmodern building. We have all these elements which are in a way purely decorative or ornamental, and do not serve any obvious function in the building. So it is interesting to ask oneself how Adorno would have reacted to postmodernism, and whether, in Adorno's view, postmodernism abandons the critical function of art. Okay, so are there any questions? Is mass culture the only way that art can survive in the modern world, or mass culture not considered by Adorno as a form of art? What is entertainment to Adorno? Okay, interesting questions. So mass culture, or the culture industry, is fundamentally deceptive for Adorno, because well, he thinks it has an ideological function of eliminating criticism of the society, because it presents a positive picture of the society and a positive picture of the possibility of life and the possibility for individuals to shape their lives. Entertainment is a more complex question, because Adorno does think that art should have an element of entertainment. So, as I said earlier on, the fact that there is this division between high art on the one hand, which can be very difficult, very demanding, actually not really very enjoyable any longer. And entertainment on the other is a problem. He says at one point, there's a very famous quotation from Adorno, that he says that the division between high art and popular art is two sides of an integral freedom to which they do not add up. That's rather similar to the quotation that I gave you from Dialectic of Enlightenment, where he says that the split between high art and mass culture is itself the truth. In other words, there's something problematic about high art just by virtue of the fact that it is separated from mass culture and it's separated from entertainment, because there is nothing inherently wrong with entertainment, if I can put it like that. But there is something wrong about the way in which high art and entertainment have become divided and opposed to each other. That's what he wants to say. Okay, are there any other questions? Oh, right, okay. The other aesthetic theories were based on a systematic approach. Why does it no longer make sense to think reality and art's inside a system? Yeah. Is this due to a loss of a cosmological harmony? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting, very important question from Raquel. So that is certainly the case. Maybe maybe I haven't talked enough about that, but I've talked about the way in which Adorno thinks that the integration of the artwork is illusory and ideological. But Adorno also thinks that about philosophical systems. It's not philosophical systems which try to integrate everything into a complete totality are also ideological as far as Adorno is concerned. This is one of the ways in which he was influenced by Nietzsche, because Nietzsche, as I'm sure some of you know, was very critical of the idea that philosophy could form a system and that everything could be comprehended within the system. So there are two aspects to this. Adorno thinks the whole idea of a philosophical system is ideological. But he also thinks that the idea of reconciliation has a utopian aspect to it. So the way in which it is actualized by Schelling or Hegel is ideological because it's presented as a reality. But the principle of reconciliation is for him a very important principle. But we have to regard that as a possibility and not as a reality. So he has a very similar critique of idealist philosophy and the idealist theory of art. And that's not surprising because Hegel thinks that art and philosophy are two forms of absolute spirit. And Schelling thinks that art is a sort of presentation of his system at the level of sensory reality. So it's not surprising that Adorno's critique of idealist systems and his critique of the idealist theory of art go together. Hope that answers the question. So Adorno's view of art as lacking social purpose in its relation to his concept of culture, and is it correct to say that mass culture is filled with a social purpose? Yeah, well, mass culture definitely has a social purpose because mass culture is part of the capitalist economy. So it has an economic function, but it also has an ideological function, because how can I put this? Members of society somehow believe they're having an experience of autonomous art, which is an experience of freedom, or it should be an experience of freedom. The experience of autonomous art should be an experience of freedom, but in fact, they're just consuming a product. It isn't in fact an autonomous artwork, but it's a commodity. So this is the function of the products of the culture industry. It's a pseudo liberation or a pseudo emancipation. It seems to offer us an alternative to everyday life or an escape from social reality, but in fact it's just a reinforcement of social reality. It's not a genuine alternative to the social reality. Okay. Are there any more questions? Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any more questions. So we can finish a little early today. Thank you all very much for coming to this course. I've really enjoyed teaching this course, and it's always very helpful for me to think about your questions, and it helps me to think about the problems. As I said to Vivian yesterday that I have a new project, and I want to do something on the philosophy of music. So this will help me to think about that project. If I was able to play music to you, I would play you music by a Russian composer called Alfred Schnittke. I don't know if any of you know the music of Alfred Schnittke, but to my mind, Schnittke is one of, there are not many, he's a successful, genuine drawer on the history of music without becoming pastiche. So maybe one day I'll be able to talk about that in one of these courses. So thank you very much again for attending. It's been a pleasure teaching this course. So there's Vivian. I'm just saying goodbye to everyone. So Vivian will send out the PowerPoints about Adorno from today, and maybe next year I'll be in Brazil. Who knows? Yeah.
For sure, Professor. Maybe next year.
Yeah.
Next year we can do the summer at the university, and it will be a pleasure to have you in the university. Thank you so much.
Well, I would like to come back. I'm looking forward to coming back. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.